Before we get into today's episode, I've created a short questionnaire that will help me get to know you better. Those that fill out the questionnaire will get entered into a draw to win an Amazon gift card. So there's a link in the description for the episode. Click it, fill out the questionnaire, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Now for today's episode. This is the Michael Brian Show. Hi everyone, welcome back to the show. And today I'm joined with Manny Wolfe, who's a lifelong entrepreneur, spends a lot of time with his hands in many different pies, but he's actually created the Advantage Education Academy, which essentially revolutionizes the education system. So Manny, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here, man. This is going to be good.
It is, and I need to know where your passion for education came from and why you went from business to education, which I imagine is a story behind it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting when you talk about the passion, right? For me, the passion is very personal because I had a terrible experience in education. And then I watched my son have a terrible experience in education. And then I watched as COVID hit, and apparently the whole world had a terrible experience in education, but it just, so during COVID, I had two coaching clients who were both in education. And it just occurred to me, like, I should really connect these two. And so we started just having these informal conversations. And out of those conversations came the question, how would you really change the world? And the reason I say really is because everybody gives lip service to changing the world, but so few people are doing it. And so we played with those questions and refined that question and refined it. And what I came up with was, if we could give a generation of kids the ability to exercise critical thinking, that would probably change the world. Because if you want to change the world, you can do it through technology and rockets and electric cars, and God bless you. Like, I'm a huge fan of the time we're living in, because of all the pace of breakthroughs is just staggering to me. Like, I feel like I'm living in the books that I used to read as a kid. You know what I mean? Like, but nobody that I know, nobody that I'm seeing, nobody who's really popular is looking at kind of upgrading the skill set of the people. And so that was where we started. That was where I started, was like, what if you could do that? What if you could teach a generation of kids critical thinking? And then it kind of, from there, it just went like, well, you couldn't do it as a standalone training or course, because you wouldn't get enough people. Even if you got 1 million people through it, which is unheard of, it wouldn't be enough. So is there a way to do it through education? Because, good marketing says, go where the people are, talk to them there. And all the kids are in, the education system. So then it was like, okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. But then the problem was, here in the US, and I think over in the UK as well, a lot of people have a lot of problems with the formalized education system. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's also a part of it where we accept it because it isn't the job for one person to fix or improve. And I've actually heard a few people say, don't necessarily try to change it, but add to it. Try to make tweaks to it rather than try to, flip the monopoly board, if you will.
Yeah. And that was where I kind of was like, we thought about that too. I thought about that. And I came to the conclusion fairly quickly that the system is too big to change from within. And so I started doing research about, like, who's trying to revolutionize education. And what I saw was a lot of fancy talk about revolutionizing education through, we have Waldorf schools, we have Montessori schools, we have private schools, we have what are they called? Basically, they're all variations of public school. They all talk a good game about changing education and flipping over the board, as you say. But when you pull back and start to look at, well, what do you actually do? They're all beholden to the same public education system standards that are the problem in the first place, right? And so,
Yeah, very often it's the rules that you play with versus, it's like
right,
if you can't do certain things, why have those as ideas?
yeah, exactly. So the idea from there was, what if? And I give all credit to Elon Musk for giving me this idea indirectly, of course. He took and used the free market to change the legacy auto manufacturing game, and that was sort of like, what if we use the free market, because you can't use the public education system here. It's too bureaucratic. It's too entrenched. It's too top heavy. Everything has to go through layers and layers and layers of people whose really their only motivation is to keep their jobs. I'll give you a fun stat. In 2019, the public education system across the US added 88% more administrators and only 8% more students.
Is that was that all?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
And so the top gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And by necessity, the more people you pack into a system, the more complex the system gets. Right. And they're serving, in air quotes, only 8% more students. So the money's not going to the right places. It's not being spent on the right things. It's not being, you know, utilized correctly or with the highest leverage. So the idea was, it's got to be, well, I've got to do this through the free market. It's the only way I can think of in the United States where you can challenge something as big as public education. And it's really interesting. 19 out of 20 or even 99 out of 100 people I talk to, either in confidence or openly, have very little faith in public education. However, a lot of them won't come out and say it for different reasons. If you are a parent with kids and you have friends that are other parents with kids, you don't necessarily want to be the one who's like, this isn't working. It's like the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah, it's almost like everyone's trying to keep their jobs at every level, whether it's parents trying to stay parents or
Yeah.
teachers trying to keep their jobs. It seems a very socially entrenched thing where everyone
Yeah.
just wants to keep things the way they've
Yeah.
always been.
Yeah. And so the best thinking I have is that somebody needs to come along and just do it from a radically different perspective. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, what's your background in education? And my background is I went through the education system. But
Yeah.
then I always say, look at what the people with backgrounds in education have given you so far. It ain't great.
No, it's not.
Yeah. And so that's where the idea came from. That was the idea was fundamentally, what if we could, so it went from critical thinking to soft skills in general. And the research, by the way, the research is overwhelming. It's pretty much conclusive that if you're putting your kids in school because you want to give them a better life, which really is the function of school, I mean, nobody can argue with that. And then the kids struggle in school, you get them a tutor, right? Well, if a tutor's job is to help you do better in school, and school's job is to help you do better in life, but it turns out that in life, what helps you the most is soft skills and leadership. So I define soft skills as communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. Those four skills are pillars to a successful life, to a
Yeah.
life where you can do whatever you want if you know how to, if you're good at those four things. And then leadership. So if the goal ultimately is a successful and fulfilled life, what you need are critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity, leadership. So then it became very clear. what I need to do, at least to start with, is to create a tutoring process that simultaneously teaches and supports the soft skills.
Right.
That's what Advantage Education Academy is about.
So where do things like critical thinking and things like that fit in if they start to critical think everything? So if you teach them the skill, and let's say
Mm-hmm.
they become critical of themselves, they become critical of the education, jobs,
Yeah,
careers, money, finance, sometimes you can almost empower them to the degree that it becomes detrimental. Now, I'm not saying everyone will do this. I'm saying that it doesn't take everyone to do it for it to become a problem, especially in this day and age. So, how do you keep it effective and helpful
sure.
rather than, let's say, like, someone could be super self-aware enough to realize they don't know anything, they have no idea who they are, and they're aware of that, which can be dangerous. Sometimes it's
Yeah,
better to not know.
I
Similar
think,
in the way people can think themselves into a corner sometimes.
yeah. So, regardless of whether you understand how to break complex situations down or not, the risk of thinking yourself into a corner and those things that you just pointed out exists. One of the things that nobody wants to talk about that I find so fascinating, um, the more that the social conversation is sort of politically charged and divisive, nobody wants to talk about the reality that there is no one solution that'll work for everyone. There just isn't. However, there's some interesting things about the law of large numbers. So one of the things that's a negative is, yeah, there's no guarantee that this is a down to the kid perfect solution, unfortunately. But because I know how to use critical thinking, I can also tell you with confidence there's no such thing as a solution that works 100% of the time. Anytime you're trying to quantify human behavior, you're working with numbers that are less than 100%. You always. So we have to start there, right? We have to start with accepting that there's no one size that fits all. However, another interesting thing about large numbers, especially when it applies to humans, is when you get a critical mass of people all moving in one direction, it creates momentum. So here's how I would predict that would shake out. If we had a generation or two of kids who knew how to reason from first principles, who understood the Socratic method, right? Who understood true critical thinking as a process. How do we take this very complicated idea that we need to solve and reduce it down to parts? And how do we validate the sort of legitimacy of those parts versus what we see running rampant now, which is called analogical thinking? And analogical thinking is, this feels like that, therefore I judge this the same way as that. Analogical thinking is why social media is so effective at being divisive. Analogical thinking is what leads people who have a vested interest in manipulating your point of view to using things like overly simplified sound bites, unnuanced conversation, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um,
it's a weird way of doing it because the people that are involved will say that they're appealing to the masses,
sure.
and that would be true if it also wasn't also kind of expecting people to live their life based on what can be written on a postage stamp.
Yeah,
And as you said, it doesn't work for everybody. So how could a soundbite work for everybody if there isn't anything that works for
right,
anybody? Never mind a soundbite that's 10 seconds long. It's not going to change your life. Which then makes
right.
me think, well, aren't behaviors and circumstances more predictable with large numbers like herd mentality and things of that nature?
Um, I think that we've gotten very good at predicting that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think that that is the argument for teaching critical thinking, teaching soft skills. That is it right there in a nutshell. Is you want to be able to first discern whether or not you believe this current thing is true. Then you need to be able to ask yourself, why do I believe it's true? what else would have to be true for this to be true? What if this weren't true? Right. And so now we're in a process of critical thinking.
Yeah.
When you have that skill set, you become more immune to overt manipulation, among other things, right? It's also very powerful for building and problem solving. But one of the things that's so attractive about it to me is, I watch people get roped into these really oversimplified divisive arguments, masks, no masks, vax, no vax, right? That's just two easy ones everyone can relate to.
Yeah.
Now, neither side is as simple and unnuanced as the arguments that we were all exposed to and probably fell victim to. Neither side. It's not if you don't wear a mask, you're a killer. And it's not if you wear a mask, you're a sheep. It's way more complex than that, right?
Definitely. Definitely.
So now let's imagine that 20 years ago, a whole generation here and a whole generation in the UK learned critical thinking. This instance in time of the pandemic would have played out completely differently because we would have been a whole generation that knew how to reason our way through complex problems.
What I would probably ask you, as a
Yeah.
devout critical thinker, and myself, that's probably well on his way to doing the same thing,
Yeah.
is how do we then make decisions and come to conclusions? How do we
Sure.
actually, because lots of people say like they're non-judgmental, and then I say, well, how do you decide? You must have a fork in the road somewhere where you choose to do
Yeah.
one thing
Yeah.
over another thing, must judge
Yeah.
one to be better than the other. Hard to get around that, really.
Yeah.
How do we actually
So
decide?
that's a great question. And while while a mastery of the soft skills, particularly critical thinking, isn't a guarantee that you'll be able to make clear, confident decisions in every situation. What it is, again, is a guarantee that you can look at the complex situations and weigh them against, for example, you weigh them against your values. But here's the difference between someone who can exercise critical thinking and Socratic principles and somebody who can't. You understand your values more deeply. You understand your values more clearly. See, a lot of us, when it comes to the values equation, the values question, we simply adopt what our parents believed. We simply adopt what our peer group growing up believed. Very few people ever sort of veer off from that. Now, teenagers will veer away and come back. That's very, very common. But the minority, the small minority, ever veers away and stays there. And of that minority, even fewer can really break down why they stayed there or believe what they believe that is sort of doesn't agree with how they were raised. So it's not so much you'll be able to make decisions because of this. What it is you'll have a process that will lead you to decisions that are more robust. And that's kind of what we need. And at a
Yeah,
certain point, it's interesting because it gets kind of meta right here. In building this business, I have come face to face with so many of my own beliefs and like sort of trapdoors in my thinking and my biases that I have to then go back and use critical thinking to get through. It's been really fascinating. And, the bigger the stakes, the more risk there is in making a decision, regardless of how well you can think it through.
of course, yeah.
So in other words, the outcome shouldn't be this will make you make better decisions. The outcome should be this will give you the tools to get through the process of making your decisions. Does that make sense?
It does, and then it also makes me think, okay, well, let's say we do this.
Yeah.
Let's say we have these two generational, critical thinking, creative, curious human beings. How do we then Yeah, I imagine you mentioned collaboration as well, which then makes me think if you teach people to work together as
Yeah.
well, you'd be teaching
Hmm.
communication, you'd be teaching how to be reasonable, teaching maybe certain compromises that you may have to make for the greater good, that sort of
Sure.
thing.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's elements of you're teaching people to think for themselves while also allowing them to get along and work in groups
Yeah.
and allow some kind of coherence. Because if we all think for ourselves and there's no crossover, well, we don't get along, do we? We just cause more arguments. So it's like we need to find a way of agreeing to want
Well,
a better expression.
I think that life automatically organizes to create situations for all of us where it's pretty clear that learning how to get along with other people is the best survival strategy. So I think that's a little bit built in. And um, I'm not sure that I can fully accept the premise that the more we can think for ourselves, the less we get along with others. I think that here's what a lot of research has shown me. I looked at what if we could change a generation of kids into better critical thinkers, and then from there I looked at what is most likely the reality of the world they'll inhabit after school, because that's an important question for anything educational based, right? Now, the current education system, which is very similar to your guys's, is it's so close to the original one that Horace Mann created 250 years ago at the direct request of factory owners, right? A group of powerful industrialists came to this guy and said, we need a process by which we can prepare people who now live in the country to work all day in factories in the city. And Horace Mann said, I got you. And the modern public education system model was born.
Yeah.
And it's very, very similar in the UK as well. Uh, but here's the reality of the work world. Here's the reality of life, especially after school. It looks less and less like factory work every decade, every year, right? And so, what are the things then in a world that is, in a very literal way, kind of unpredictable? Like, we don't know what 15 years from now is going to look like, but we can be pretty sure it is going to be wild and amazingly science fiction-y. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
To be
so,
fair, I'm still waiting for my hoverboard, if I'm being
right,
brutally
so am
honest.
I. So am I. But here's the thing. What's our best guess at what skills will be the most useful in a world where new industries are popping up, old ones are dying, robots are literally taking jobs, menial jobs. The whole landscape is changing. And I'm basing everything on a prediction. The prediction is this: being able to collaborate, being able to have the skill to know when it's time for you to lead and when it's time for you to be a supportive follower of a team, being able to move between different teams, being able to articulate your position, being able to be humble enough and empathic enough to hear other positions and be influenced by them. These are the core skills that I'm willing to bet will create thriving, successful lives as technology and all these other forces come in to move us further and further away from this post-industrial revolution model of how to live.
This paints quite a bleak situation that we're currently in. If we're having to teach people how to be creative and critical think, when, if I'm not mistaken, Manny, quite a few of us were questioning everything before we entered the education system. We didn't really know much, but we were questioning everything. Like the kid that says why to everything, the most
Yeah,
annoying kid in the world. So
right.
I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of it that's trained out of us that we're
right,
starting to realize that we need afterwards.
right. The irony is almost tragic. In school,
Yeah.
collaborating together to get the right answer is called cheating. In work, it's called succeeding. In life, creativity is one of the most valued, most society propelling forces there is, and yet public school, by and large, is doing everything it can to stamp out creativity. The mismatch was bad enough, in the earlier part of my life. But when technology comes into the equation and starts changing the landscape so rapidly, it really casts a harsh light on everything personality wise that they're sort of requiring of you during school is very much the opposite of what you need to have a great life after school. And, there are a lot of people who come forward and point this out and complain about it, but no one who's done anything except try to iterate ever so slightly off of the current public school model. It's like if you have a car and you say you're going to rebuild it from the ground up, but all you really do is change the paint color and the wheels. That's what every attempt I've seen to change public education has been. It's been window dressing.
And then if you use the car analogy as well, you only know a car to look a certain way, to have certain parts. So if anyone gives you the parts of a car to build a car from scratch, they're going to give you what they know a car would be made like, the different parts, the different materials.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of you coming up with something remotely different from what already came before, just because of the way of thinking and the parts that you're given, it's going to be very unlikely that you'll come up with anything better because you're given the same parts, you've got the same way of thinking,
right,
how a car is supposed to be, and
yeah,
you think, well, why set people up in that way then? Why tell people to think differently, to be creative, to be curious, if the
right,
models that they're given to be those things with is
yeah,
the same as what's already been? It's almost like you've got to rewrite everything from scratch. Don't take any biases or
yeah,
anything from the
yeah,
previous way of doing things. Start again. And right,
yeah,
creativity is what? You're creating something from nothing. So you've got to
yeah,
start from zero and get to anything. And
which
then
is
being curious,
exactly,
what is it?
yeah,
Curious is exploring. It's
yeah,
it, it's discovery as opposed to being told anything.
mimicry,
Yeah,
yeah,
mimicry and
yeah,
doing things that are very slightly different from previous generations.
right,
So I think it's something that I actually think that the best option that we had at the time when it was created was the education system because it was the only way
mhm,
to, I mean, if you think about it, give people that don't really know an awful lot and say, okay, good luck, find it out for yourself. You won't really know where to start because they've got no foundation to go on. It's
yeah,
almost like we needed the education system before we realized just how bad it was. And that we needed to go through that. We need factory farming to get to the point where we
yeah,
realize how bad it was. Now we've got indoor farms, fantastic, but we've had to experience it to realize how bad it was, and we've had to cope with the fact that we're growing as a species at an alarming rate. We've had to find a way of surviving. That seemed like the only way with the tools that we had. I'm hoping that things are very different now. Myself, personally, is kind of where I'm at.
so I agree with you that especially that when the public education model was created, it was the perfect thing for the time. It was, and a lot of people, when we talk about the creation of the public education model, they speak of it in negative tones. I'm not so sure that was the case back during the Industrial Revolution. I'm thinking that a lot of people were lifted up into a better quality of life. And so that's, as you say, it was a really good thing for the time. The problem with bureaucracies, this is something that I find very interesting and very few people talk about. Bureaucracies, once a structure sort of rises to the level of being a bureaucracy, it sort of shifts its objective, and I don't think it happens consciously, but you learn about this in organizational behavior degrees and stuff like that. Um, Bureaucracies sort of have this point where they tilt to become self-serving rather than serving the goal for which they were originally created. And the public education system, I mean, the stat I shared with you earlier, 88% more administrators and executive level jobs for 8% more students. is crazy. It's crazy. There's a psychosis in that. And that to me suggests that the bureaucracy it can't distinguish anymore between serving its end goal and serving itself. So, yes, the next thing that you said that I really like is you sort of pointed to starting again from scratch. And that's what I think has to happen now, because at a certain point it's like, why even mess with that enormous bureaucratic structure when we're lucky enough to have the free market, which allows us to build whatever we want and see if the public wants it. So I think it's I think it's the right time. I think it's the right idea. And who knows, like in 250 years, this idea that I've created may become the thing that everybody points at and goes, oh, that needed to change 150 years ago. But for right now, for right now, as far as I can tell, it's the only game in town that's really trying to prepare children for the life they're going to inhabit after school in the most forward-looking way possible.
I often mention to friends that I know offline and online is that there's a generation of children being born now that may not actually need to work.
Right.
So whether it
Yeah.
be technology taking over a lot of jobs
Mm-hmm.
now, like I imagine tutors being on that list, given it's mostly just regurgitated information for the most part. And then you've got AI and robotics and all the
Mm-hmm.
things that are coming out now. There are children being born now, today, which would be the beginning of 2023.
Mm-hmm.
They will probably not need to get jobs by the time they're 18, 20, maybe 25 if they stay in education long enough. Hopefully,
Yeah.
your education money. And that's the kind of situation where you have to ask the question of what would they actually do with their time?
Yeah. That's a really fascinating. So here's what comes up for me when I ponder that question. I feel like human beings are inherently creative. And not every one of us, not to a man, although I think it's a potential that is within all of us. Now, I always avoid things like those blanket generalizations, like everyone has the potential for genius. I don't believe that's true. I think that's just a feel good kind of aphorism.
Yeah.
But I do think that creativity in the not in the romantic sense either for you guys listening. I mean, creativity is just it's just it's a dispassionate force. Creativity is not inherently good or bad. It's just the force for reorganizing things and creating things. Not all of them succeed, but to your point, I believe that creativity is it's hardwired into us. And so if we got to a point where, let's say, AI was taking care of all of our basic needs and we were free to express ourselves however we chose. A couple of things, I think. One is we would still need to collaborate with each other. We would still need to think critically. You know what I mean? Those skills would be more important than ever before. And the other is, I think it would sort of unbridle human creative expression. I think it would be impossible now to predict the kind of things we'd build if all we had to do was build.
Yeah, it's an interesting point as well, which also makes me think of what would we value as well? Like what would be
Yeah.
important? Like would we be the kind of people that would actually work for a living? Or would we say, right, well, we've got all our needs met. We've got machines and technology building things at
Mm-hmm.
the speed that we can dream them up.
Yeah.
What happens then? Do we work? Do we go back to what we used to, like sitting in front of campfires, playing songs? Like, what would life actually be like if not only survival was taken care of, but
Mm-hmm.
progress was taken care of? Like, we didn't need to force ourselves to grow, to change, to adapt, to create new things, as
Right.
it was all
Right.
done for us, what would be left? And then what would be important? Because without those kinds of jobs, we wouldn't necessarily need money as much as we do now. Like we wouldn't need to
Yeah.
rely
Yeah.
on it because everything's taken care of. Everything's done. Like,
Hmm.
why would I need to work 40, 50, 60, 100 hours a week for a minimum wage job or even a business
Right.
when everything's taken care of? Like, where would the motivation be outside of being creative, being artistic, expressing yourself, doing something that you enjoy? But
Yeah.
then if we don't need money because we don't need to spend it because it's all taken care of,
Yeah.
what happens then? There's so many different rabbit holes to go down
Yeah. I
once you
agree.
take care of like once the pebble's taken care of and you drop it into the ocean, the
Hmm.
ripple effect is a lot bigger than I think most people necessarily realize because most people don't think of long-term unintended consequences. So we
Well,
don't necessarily think in those terms, do we?
no, we don't. Now, I myself am an optimist, and I keep that to myself for the most part because it's such a contrarian view.
Yeah.
But I myself am an optimist, and I think that if we ever got to that place, I think the motivation would come from like for myself. I took other than creating mentally and strategically, I took the last year off. I put myself in a situation where it's like I don't have to work to bring any money in. I don't have to worry about that. And what happened to me was I said, okay, I'm going to just relax until the thing I really want to pour myself into comes along. And it wound up being this, although I had originally thought of this 2.5 years ago or whatever it was. I wasn't in a position where I could just kind of, sink into it like this until a year ago or so. Um, I know that there are people who create for the sake of creation, who build for the sake of building, who um, they do for the sake of doing. Now, I think one of the things you're asking is, would that be everybody or would that just be a small subsection of people? I don't know the answer to that, but it would be interesting. I think that the optimistic case would be that it could be a sort of a second age of enlightenment. That was so look, the Romans and the Greeks had the two classes, and the lower class were fundamentally basically slaves, sustenance farmer types. But the and they did that so that the upper class could spend all of their time exploring math and science and music and philosophy. And while I don't condone building an egalitarian society on the back of slavery and suffering,
Yeah.
if the idea was that technology and AI and robots and all that was taking care of all of the stuff that in antiquity the slave class took care of, leaving us to just explore the furthest reaches of our mind, then also with this super high baseline, I think really good things could come of that. Now, I heard a couple of interesting things on the technology front and the science front that I feel like tie into this. So, for one, recently, the super collider at CERN in Sweden or Norway or wherever it is, for the first time ever, achieved positive fusion. I don't think people understand the implications of this. They created an explosion that created more energy than it took. That's a game changer. Way more than Chat GPT is a game changer.
Oh, I've heard way too much about that recently. It's driving me
Right.
insane.
So we have successfully, in a controlled environment, done experiments that gave us a net positive of energy. The implications of this are staggering. While at the same time, theoretical physicists have proven faster than light travel. the implications of this are staggering. So where does
Especially
my
if you
mind,
combine the two together, I
thank
imagine
you.
you
That's where
can
my mind
combine
went.
them. Yeah.
That's where my mind went. I heard both of those things within 2 days of each other, and I was like, space travel. That's where this is heading.
Yeah. It is.
Space
Yeah.
travel on renewable energy. That's where this is going. Deep space travel. I don't know where it's actually going, but these are the kind of things that excite me. And sort of to your question, theoretical physicists are people who are just pushing the boundaries. They have no objectives, right? It's just creativity and answering questions for the sake of itself. And then with a history of knowing that really powerful innovation comes from that. So I remain unshakably optimistic about humanity.
I think I heard as well that a lot of the scientific discoveries take roughly 40 to 50 years before they start to integrate them and find a use
Sure,
for them and
sure.
things like
Yeah,
that. They take a long time.
yeah.
So does this mean that we'll actually have time travel in 50 years? I hope not, because I'd like to use it. I don't think I'd be around in 50 years. Who knows? But I think there's a definite sense of when you better educate people,
Yeah.
everyone benefits in some way, shape, or
Everyone
form.
wins. Yeah,
Everyone wins.
yeah.
And my question to yourself as well is, are we ready for something like that? Like, do we need jobs to be taken care of before we sit down and think, right, well, we don't need to teach people this, this, and this because it's
Mm.
taken care of already. Now we can start to train things like soft skills, or you think perhaps you need it ready for when that happens because it's most likely going to happen.
Well, let me answer that from a more sort of a less romantic, more pragmatic point of view. Right now, today, the number one thing that employers are looking for in candidates is critical thinking. It's the number one thing they're screening for, and they're having a hard time finding it. Right. So there's a use case that's just dollars and cents. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, my wife is a technical recruiter, and so for the last, God, I don't know, I want to say 22 years, what she's done is she's placed highly skilled programmers and other sort of people in tech into hard to fill jobs. Now, we were on one of our walks, we were sort of estimating what it costs for, let's say, Microsoft or Google or Apple to find someone to fill something higher than an entry level job, and to take someone and move them to a third or fourth level up kind of job, right? Now, this is not a scientific number. This is an educated guess that's pretty close to reality because she works in the industry. This is something nobody thinks about, at least I don't hear people talking about. To get someone who like can lead a skilled team, it costs almost $750,000 to find people to fill those kind of roles. Because typically you got to find people, you got to bring them in at a lower level, you have to train them up. And so not only do you have the cost of training them, the cost of paying them, but you also have the opportunity cost over 3 or 4 years of them not already doing the job. It's staggering how much it costs to put someone in a really highly skilled role, especially within tech. And I would imagine the same is for every other highly skilled role. So now imagine right out of high school, kids are not only ready to perform those higher level roles, but they've got the personality traits to do it. Because at that level, you have to have culture fit, you have to have team fit. There's all these other things that come into play that determine whether somebody gets one of those jobs or not. You got to be able to exercise critical thinking, right? You got to be able to evaluate your own thought process and all these things that are ironically stamped out of us all through high school, all through K through 12 education,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
so there's a more sort of like mundane use case where you could, I mean, the net positive contribution to the GDP, if everybody was trained up in soft skills and then able to pursue their interests more, which is another dynamic that we're working on, but we're not working on it at the tutoring level. At the next level up, we're looking at how can we team up again, let's say with tech. How can we partner with tech to create really, really amazing, like modern apprenticeship programs, so that you can have somebody ready for a higher tier role right out of high school. You don't lose the opportunity cost, you don't lose the training cost, right? And so for that same $750,000, you might get 10 people that can fill those roles for you versus one.
So would this be a way of essentially giving people the effect that experience might have on someone without the legwork and the years put into giving them that? Like it might take somebody a year or three to get the experience enough to be able to think outside the box because you've played within the
Mm-hmm.
box long enough that you want to think outside of it. Someone that goes in thinking that way from day one, they don't have to
Yeah,
learn that lesson through
yeah.
experience.
Well, what I'm suggesting at that level is two things. Instead of teaching them the opposite of those skills and then flipping it around in college and then going, guess what? I know what we taught you this for the last 12 years, but now it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
And then, also 4 years of college. What if we could move the whole time frame down from, let's say, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade? So you're in school, but you've shown an aptitude or an interest for whatever it is. And we've got apprenticeship programs set up with the top companies in that field. So instead of continuing on with this fairly arbitrary set of requirements, you're now diving into what you're interested in. And if you're in one of these apprenticeship programs, let's say that every summer you actually go apprentice with the company, whether it's virtually or in person. So by the time the end of 12th grade rolls around, you're qualified, you have critical thinking, you know the soft skills, you've proven yourself as a team member. Boom, right into the role.
And then technology would fill the lower critical jobs, the ones that are essentially just based on productivity, I suppose you could say.
That's one possible outcome, but another, again, with every time you're dealing with humans, remember there's no such thing as 100%, right? The reality is not everyone would matriculate toward um, the apprenticeship programs. Some people wouldn't decide yet. Some people wouldn't show the aptitude, and those people, like, we could destigmatize, and we should destigmatize just a regular pathway through school and into work. Some of us, like for me, I don't know if there were any circumstances that you could have put me in at a high school age that would have set me on one track that I would have stayed with my whole life. I was just too curious and too unfocused, and you know, but there's nothing wrong with that either, or there doesn't have to be. So maybe it's technology taking those lower level jobs, or maybe it's just people who are multi-interested, we'll say, you know, or
Yeah,
who just haven't figured it out yet.
I wonder actually if it'll actually work, as in the timing will be just right, as in when technology takes over, when the social dynamics shift, when education needs to change,
Mm-hmm.
it will happen on its own, or do you think people like yourself, Manny, will actually have to force the issue, like to make people see there has to be a bit of resistance, a bit of maybe you launch it and everyone kind of laughs at you because it's too early and no one would value these things. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, oh, there's no more driver jobs or all the teachers
Right.
about to work.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
and then we go, oh, well, maybe we do actually have to learn these things because that's what everyone's asking for with these higher levels when there are more jobs at that
Right.
level because
Right.
they've needed to create them to keep up with the demand and things like that. So, what direction do you think it would take for something like this to be adopted? I know they look for it currently, but sometimes
Mhm.
it's like, well, maybe we want to wait until they've got a certain level of education first, so that we can skip over the dotting the I's and crossing the T's because they've already done those
Yeah.
kinds of things. How do you think we would progress for the soft skills in education to be what we teach? Like, what sort of version of the progress do you think will happen first?
I think it will follow the standard adoption distribution curve. That's what I think will, because one of the things that I love about all things regarding human nature is the reliability of the standard distribution curves. They just never fail you. And so there's going to be a small percentage who really hear the message and go, God, I've been waiting for this. I'm in. Then there'll be another percentage that look at that first group and go, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. Then typically the adoption curve tells us that then after those first two groups, it dips. And that's the dip of mass adoption. Now, my best case scenario, obviously, is that the social forces at work will help bridge the mass adoption dip. Because there's a lot of social forces at work, right? There's technology changing things, as you say. There's a generation of kids who are realizing, Lord help me, they can make more money showing their butts on Instagram. You know, don't want that to continue, but I digress.
No.
Um, but you know what I mean? Like the landscape is changing, and so my argument is to parents that you need to instill this ability to discern values in your children. You need to instill the self-inherent worthiness of being a good friend, a good team member, a good human, a contributing member of society. Those things are like only going to get more valuable. They're not going to get less valuable. And so, yeah, again, my best case scenario is that things like social media platforms will sort of get top heavy and flip over on themselves because they're so gratuitous, right? Like I look at, I actually opted to not have Facebook show me Instagram reels anymore because it to me is just there's a deadness of soul in what most people are doing on there. It's just like I can't even believe it. I'm scrolling through Facebook to see what people are up to, and Facebook goes, "Oh, would you like to see Instagram Reels?" And without even leaving to look at the Reels, they give you that little section there where you can scan 5 Reels,
Yeah.
and it's somebody talking about something horrible and then dancing. Like, what is this? So I don't know what the pessimistic case is for adoption. I don't have an answer for you there, but my optimistic case is that, as you get older, you're forced to realize the importance of being a good friend, being a critical thinker, knowing how to integrate into teams. Those things are self-evident to older people. And so I'm hoping that the argument, hits the right people the right way so that when we get past the early adopters and the secondary adopters to the mass market adoption, it's just parents going, "Oh yeah, this is clearly something my kids need."
What do you think that like the education system would need to change? Because let's just say we spark the fire that causes the education system to say, you know what, we need to change what we teach the kids because
Yeah,
it's not working. What should they do if they have that conversation? All the powers to be sit down and think,
yeah,
right, we need to change this. It's not working.
yeah,
There aren't enough jobs to go around. We're
right.
losing higher quality jobs because we're not teaching them these skills. What should they do? And then also, as a secondary to that, why should they do it? What would be the best vested interest for people to make these changes?
Well, the best answer I have ready at hand for that is Henry Ford famously said, I didn't ask people what they wanted because if I did, they would have said a faster horse. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Elon Musk said, similar words. He goes, I didn't ask people if they wanted an electric car. I set out to prove that electric cars could beat gas cars in every measurable dimension. They could be funner, cooler, sexier, faster, safer, right? And that's my goal. My goal is less about having a dialogue with public education or in any way sort of directly trying to help them improve, but instead ignoring them completely and building the proof of a better model. And they can do with it what they will. They can call me and I can consult. They can crumble and die. Like, I mean, I really, I am optimistic, but one thing I'm not optimistic about is bureaucratic organizations changing. That's not something I've seen a track record of success with, throughout history or in my lifetime. Bureaucracies they get so slow and so bloated, so much red tape, so much bureaucracy, that they can't return to being nimble.
Yeah, it's almost
And,
like everyone's trying to save their own jobs, that they'll
right. Yes.
go through all the different channels,
Yeah.
even though they could probably do it themselves if there were less people at the
It
organization.
it becomes self-serving at a systemic level. That's sort of another way of saying of talking about the problem with bureaucracies. At a systemic level, they become self-serving entities when originally they were to serve a different function, whatever it is. You know, so I think that if the whole world saw a more successful model that was proving itself, contrasted with the public education model, I could envision even politicians finally going, hey, we need to look at this. Just in the same way, again, with electric cars, that when Elon Musk was first building the Tesla Roadster, nobody even cared. And then as he started to build the S and the X, that was when Ford and GM and Toyota and everybody started talking shit about it. Right. That was when people started bad mouthing him. And now, 2 weeks ago, I see the new electric Ford F-150 being rolled out as if they thought of something new.
Oh, wow, something new.
So yeah, I see these guys and like just as a side note, that would be the worst marketing gig in the world to have to be the one. The only one worse than that is the next electric vehicle from a big automaker who has to pretend they thought of something that isn't already, self-evident.
Yeah, or like the new iPhones that they just make a bit bigger and fit everything
Right.
else in
Yeah.
with a slightly
Hey,
better
look at
camera.
this.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
but do you see the approach that I'm taking? The approach I'm taking
Yeah.
is if we can build it and we can create success and it's proves itself, that's success. That's what we're after. And then let public education do whatever it's going to do. By that time, I imagine they would actually be coming after us pretty hard in the press if we ever get that far. That's what I would guess. And I would guess that coming after us hard and attacking us in the press would be the step right before, hey, maybe we better look at what they're doing.
How would you encourage companies to notice, appreciate, value the system that you'll create? Because let's say you get a job, and whether
Mhm.
it's certain courses that you would need before
Yeah.
you got in for the job, how would you as a company go about creating something that the companies sit back and go, you know what, they're important courses that we need to recognize? Because if you get a course that's in Europe or America, they don't always crossover. Like they don't
Yeah.
always notice or
Mhm.
even value courses from other countries, let's say.
Yeah.
How would you help with that?
So to answer that question, I think you have to go back to a strong grasp of universal fundamentals. So math comes to mind as a great example, right? Um, it's so ironic that when we have kids, they all throw, when am I ever going to use this at us when they don't want to do their math homework? And then yet
Yeah.
as adults, we see the importance of understanding math everywhere. So things like things like a strong comprehension of math, a strong comprehension of communication. Communication is one that could be reconfigured completely. I don't think most people need to know how to diagram a sentence, for instance. But most people should know and don't know how to effectively and persuasively make a point, how to organize a presentation, how to speak from stage or to groups, right? So I would say the specific trainings that an organization needed or something like that would fall under our vision for apprenticeship programs. However, my goal with Advantage Education Academy, once we go past tutoring and into offering a full option for school, is, by the 10th grade, students should have a commanding uh, uh, understanding of math, of communication, of, what else is really important? Philosophy is really important. I'm not sure that history in the way it's taught now is a huge deal, but maybe, a case could be made for it. But I also think that if you were to, let's say that the core philosophical goal of teaching history was so that people could learn from history versus like pushing one side's agenda, pushing the agenda of the winners, right? Whatever that looks like. Let's say that was the goal. Then history would be very important because it would be helping to produce people who could look back through time to learn their lessons and things like that. I think that there's so much fluff, there's so much filler, there's so much unneeded minutia in what currently constitutes a classical liberal arts education up to the 12th grade level. You could probably trim out 40% of it. You could replace 20% of it. And by the 10th grade, you could have powerful, autonomous, self-authored people who could then start exploring their interests.
I'm actually picturing a course on your system, which is called the History of the Education System, and
Yeah.
trying to sort of teach people, like this is why it was wrong, this is why it didn't
Mm-hmm.
work. And you've got case studies of kids saying, how am I going to use this? And the
Mm-hmm.
whole course is pretty elaborate after our conversation today.
That would be a good one.
It would. I actually picture it being like the only course in the history section. You'd be
Yeah.
like, do we need to know about the Romans? Do we need to know about, I don't know, some other, I don't know, like
Right.
who built the pyramids? No, we
Right.
just put the education system in there. We need to convince them that the old way is not the best way.
Yeah.
Manny, this has been fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think that if we keep speaking, we'll eventually put the world to rights, but it's going to be a long time coming, that's for sure. Those that want to get involved, maybe they want to
Mm-hmm.
help out, maybe they want to contribute, invest, whatever the case is, they want to enter your world and the education system that you're putting together. How can people find out about it?
So what I'll give you for your show notes is, of course, the website. And the website does have contact forms. I'll give you my direct email. And I'll also give you the link to the book that we have coming out about lighting the spark of lifelong success for your children. And what it does is it makes the case for why we need reform. And it talks about how our approach to teaching and tutoring incorporates soft skills, incorporates leadership, while helping kids to thrive in all of their academic subjects. So I'll get those three things over to you. And for you guys listening, if you'd like to think about getting your kids enrolled, go to the website, shoot me an email. If you want the book, the link will be there. It's yours for free. And that should do it.
Thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Those that are listening, feel free to subscribe, share the show, tell others, and also leave a review wherever you are listening into your podcasts. Manny, thanks so much, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Thanks very much.